I think I might hold the world record for the most expensive act of revenge against a homeowners association in history. It cost them their homes, their president's freedom, and the entire shady little empire they'd built. They illegally sold 2,500 acres of my family's farmland, land that had been in my bloodline since the territory was first charted. So, I found a perfectly legal, devastatingly creative way to sell their homes right out from under them. Stick around, because this story gets absolutely insane. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'm always curious to see how far these stories travel. It all started not with a bang, but with a beige envelope. An aggressively beige envelope, the kind of soul-sucking manila that only bureaucracy can produce, taped to the ancient oak gatepost that marks the entrance to my property. For context, I'm a forensic accountant. My job is to sift through mountains of financial data to find the one rotten number that brings a whole corrupt enterprise crashing down. I spend my days unraveling complex fraud schemes for high-stakes corporate clients. Patience and an obsession with detail aren't just virtues in my line of work, they're weapons. This will become important later. But when I wasn't untangling financial knots in the city, my sanctuary was the farm. It wasn't a working farm anymore, not in the traditional sense. It was 2,500 acres of rolling hills, ancient forests, and sprawling meadows that my great-great-great-grandfather had staked a claim on generations ago. It was my history, my sanity, and the one place on earth that felt truly mine. My parents had left it to me with one simple instruction: never let the concrete win. The problem was, the concrete was getting closer. A few years back, a developer had bought the adjacent parcel of land and erected the Gilded Meadows, a hyper-manicured, obsessively regulated community of McMansions. It was an HOA neighborhood, of course, the kind where the color of your mailbox could spark a multi-month-long tribunal. Their border abutted the eastern edge of my property, a fact that seemed to cause them no end of distress. My wild, untamed land was a personal affront to their beige and taupe sensibilities. Leading the charge against the natural offense of my property was the HOA president, a woman named Carol Hess. Carol was a stereotype made flesh. She was perpetually clad in expensive but tasteless leisure wear, drove a white Lexus SUV the size of a small Rhino, and had a haircut you could set your watch to. Her face was a permanent mask of condescending pity. As if the entire world were a poorly managed department store she was perpetually on the verge of lodging a complaint against. Our initial interactions were predictably petty. I received violation notices for overgrown vegetation, which was, the entire point of a forest. I got fines for unapproved agricultural structures, referring to a 100-year-old barn that was a registered historical landmark. I got a notice that my fence line, which had been there since before the state was a state, was 3 inches non-compliant with their newly established community aesthetic guidelines. I treated these notices as the ravings of a lunatic and filed them away in a folder I'd ironically labeled Suburban Warfare. I sent a single, polite, registered letter to the HOA board with a copy of my property survey, a brief history of the land, and a clear statement of my legal property rights, assuming that even a board run by Carol had to have a shred of reason. I was wrong. The notices only escalated. The real bombshell, however, arrived in that beige envelope on my gatepost. It wasn't a fine. It wasn't a warning. It was a public notice of land transfer. My heart hammered against my ribs as I read it. According to the document, the Gilded Meadows Homeowners Association had successfully petitioned the county for an abandoned property annexation of a 2,500-acre parcel adjacent to their development. It cited years of neglect, failure to maintain, and claimed the land posed a public nuisance and fire hazard. The document further stated that following the successful annexation, the entire parcel had been sold to the very same developer who built the Gilded Meadows, a company called Sterling Homes. A preliminary development plan for the Gilded Meadows Phase 2 was already on file with the County Planning Commission. They had sold my land, my entire farm, my family's legacy. They had stolen it, wrapped their theft in bureaucratic language, and sold it for what I would later discover was a staggering sum of money. The air rushed out of my lungs. It was a physical blow. I stumbled back from the gate, the crinkled paper shaking in my hand. Disbelief is a funny thing. It's a fog that your brain throws up to protect you from a reality too sharp to handle. This couldn't be real. It was a mistake. A grotesque administrative error. But then I looked at the letterhead. I saw the official county seal. I saw the name Carol Hess, President, Gilded Meadows HOA, listed as the primary petitioner. And I saw the name of the law firm representing them, a notorious Shark Tank known for aggressive and often ethically dubious development deals. This was no mistake. This was a coup. They had watched my land, coveted it, and then, with breathtaking audacity, they had simply taken it. A cold, hard anger, colder and harder than anything I had ever felt, began to form in the pit of my stomach. It displaced the shock, solidified the disbelief into a diamond-hard point of clarity. They thought I was just some quiet recluse who would be easily steamrolled. They saw an old farm and assumed the owner was as antiquated as the barn. They had profoundly, catastrophically underestimated me. They didn't know I dismantled multi-million-dollar fraud cases for a living. They had just declared war, and in doing so, they'd handed me the audit of a lifetime. Standing there, with the notice of my own dispossession in hand, I made a quiet vow, not just to my parents' memory, but to myself. I wasn't just going to get my land back. I was going to dismantle the Gilded Meadows, brick by beige brick. I was going to use their own rules, their own system, and my own unique set of skills to make them pay for every single square inch. Carol Hess and her smug little kingdom had just picked a fight with a man who knew exactly how to find where the bodies, both literal and financial, were buried. The first step in any war is reconnaissance. Before I unleashed hell, I needed a map of it. My city office, a sterile environment of glass and steel, suddenly felt like the perfect command center for the coming campaign. The beige envelope, my call to arms, was smoothed out and pinned to the large corkboard where I usually tracked intricate webs of money laundering. It looked strangely at home. My professional life and personal crisis had just merged into one glorious, righteous crusade. My first 24 hours were a blur of caffeine and focused fury. I dove into the county's online records database. Property deeds, tax assessments, planning commission minutes, historical surveys. I downloaded everything. I cross-referenced plat maps from the 1880s with modern satellite imagery. My land, the Miller homestead, was clearly and unequivocally defined, its borders as solid in law as they were in soil for over a century. There was no ambiguity, no loophole. This wasn't an obscure boundary dispute. This was grand larceny dressed up in a zoning petition. My next step was to understand the enemy. I pulled the Articles of Incorporation for the Gilded Meadows HOA. I got their bylaws, their covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC rupees, and every single filed amendment. It was a tome of suburban tyranny, hundreds of pages dictating everything from the approved species of lawn grass to the maximum allowable height of a child's swing set. It was petty, controlling, and utterly devoid of reason. But within that petty text, I knew there had to be a weakness. Every system, no matter how oppressive, has a flaw. You just have to have the patience to read the entire monstrous manual. While that downloaded, I started digging into Carol Hess. Public records are a beautiful thing. I found her previous addresses, her political donations, small but always to the most pro-developer local candidates, and a few minor civil suits she'd been involved in, mostly disputes with contractors who claimed she'd stiffed them on payment. A pattern of entitlement and a belief that rules were for other people began to emerge. Then I hit the real jackpot. Her husband, Richard Hess. He was listed as the treasurer on the HOA's official filings. Interesting. A husband and wife team holding the two key positions of power. That raised an immediate red flag for internal control weakness. I also pulled the corporate records for the developer, Sterling Homes. They were a regional player with a reputation for moving fast and cutting corners. They'd been fined in a neighboring state for environmental violations and had a history of suing anyone who tried to slow down their projects. They were aggressive bullies, a perfect partner for a domestic tyrant like Carol. This entire scheme reeked of collusion. An HOA doesn't just wake up one day and decide to annex 2,500 acres. This was a coordinated play. I was operating on the assumption that Sterling Homes had identified my land, realized I wasn't selling, and then activated Carol as their local asset to steal it through a fraudulent legal process. The abandoned property claim was the linchpin. They were arguing I had abandoned the farm. It was a lie, and a flimsy one at that, but a lie that had apparently been convincing enough for some drone in the county records office to stamp a seal on it. Armed with this preliminary data, I decided it was time to make my first move. I wasn't going to storm into an HOA meeting and start screaming. That's what they'd expect. That was the emotional response they could dismiss. No, my first contact had to be clinical, surgical. I drafted a simple 2-paragraph letter addressed to the Gilded Meadows HOA Board of Directors, care of Carol Hess. I also CC'd their registered legal counsel and the CEO of Sterling Homes. The letter calmly stated my identity as the legal owner of the parcel in question, cited the official deed number, and pointed out the fraudulent nature of the abandoned property claim. I included a photo of me standing in front of my front gate, holding a newspaper dated from the previous day. I also included copies of my last 5 years of property tax payments, all paid in full, on time. I demanded an immediate and full rescission of the annexation and a nullification of the sale to Sterling Homes, stating that failure to comply within 5 business days would result in immediate and aggressive legal action, seeking damages far in excess of the land's value. I sent it via every possible method: certified mail, courier, email, and even had a process server deliver a copy directly to Carol's beige-colored front door. Her response came 4 days later, not in a letter, but in a phone call. It was a blocked number. "Mr. Miller," she began, her voice dripping with the sort of saccharine condescension that could curdle milk. "Carol Hess here. We received your little note." I remained silent. In my work, I've learned that the person who is uncomfortable with silence will always be the first to give something away. "I'm not sure what you hope to achieve," she continued, a slight edge creeping into her voice. "The county has made its determination. The land was an eyesore and a fire trap, a public nuisance. We acted for the good of the community. Sterling Homes is going to create a beautiful expansion, with walking trails and a lovely water feature. The good of the community doesn't grant you the right to steal my property, Mrs. Burke." "Hess," I said, keeping my tone perfectly flat. "My family has paid taxes on that land for over 150 years. The claim of abandonment is a demonstrable fraud, and you know it." There was a huff on the other end of the line. "Well, that's a very serious accusation. Our lawyers handled the whole process. Everything was done by the book. You had your chance to contest the petition, and you failed to do so." "I can't contest a petition I was never legally served notice of," I retorted. This was a key piece. They would have been required to show they'd made a good faith effort to notify me. They had obviously lied about that. Taping a notice to a gate on a 2,500-acre property doesn't count, and again, you know it. She switched tactics. "Look, Mr. Miller, I understand this is emotional for you, an old family farm and all that. Sterling Homes is prepared to be generous. They've authorized me to offer you a nuisance settlement, a goodwill gesture, $50,000, to just let this go and walk away quietly. $50,000. For land worth, at a conservative estimate, 40 to 50 million. The sheer insulting audacity of it was breathtaking. It was like a mugger stealing your wallet and then offering to give you bus fare home. "Carol," I said, and for the first time, I let a sliver of the ice I was feeling into my voice. "Let me be crystal clear. That isn't an offer. It's an insult. And it's also evidence of criminal intent. You're admitting you know my claim is valid and are trying to buy my silence." "Thank you for that." The line went quiet for a moment. I could almost hear the gears grinding in her head. "You're making a big mistake," she finally hissed, the syrupy facade completely gone. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. We will bury you in legal fees. You will lose, and you will have nothing. This is your last chance." "No, Carol," I replied, a slow smile spreading across my face that she couldn't see. "It's yours. I suggest you consult your husband, the treasurer, and ask him about the concept of fiduciary duty, because when I'm done, legal fees will be the least of your worries." I hung up the phone. The conversation had confirmed everything. They were arrogant, they were confident, and they were criminals. And they had just given me my next target, the money. It was time to introduce Richard Hess, the HOA treasurer, to the joys of a full-scale forensic audit. I wasn't just a landowner they had wronged anymore. I was their worst nightmare, an expert who was now personally, profoundly, and professionally motivated to find every dirty little secret they had. My conversation with Carol was the starting gun. The insult of her $50,000 offer was fuel, turning the cold fire of my anger into a jet engine of purpose. My next arena of battle wasn't the county courthouse. Not yet. It was the numbers. It was the Gilded Meadows financial soul, and Richard Hess, Carol's husband and the HOA's treasurer, was its gatekeeper. I needed to get my hands on their books. Most state laws governing HOAs grant members the right to inspect financial records. The problem was, I wasn't a member. I was the sworn enemy. A direct request would be stonewalled for months, if not indefinitely. I needed a man on the inside. I needed an ally within the pristine walls of the Gilded Meadows. Finding one seemed daunting. The place was a monument to conformity. But I remembered the various violation notices I'd received. They were always signed by the HOA board, but the complaints themselves were often anonymous. However, a few of the older ones, from years ago, were attributed to a specific board member who had since left. A little digging led me to Arthur Penwright, a retired civil engineer who had served on the Gilded Meadows board for its first 2 years before abruptly resigning. I found his new address in a quiet condo complex on the other side of town. I decided to pay him a visit. Arthur was a man in his late 70s with a gentle face and eyes that had seen too many pointless arguments over lawn gnomes. When I introduced myself, he knew my name, or rather, my farm's name, immediately. "The Miller Homestead," he said, a sad smile touching his lips. "I told them to leave you alone. I told Carol that poking that particular bear was a fool's errand. She said the wildness of your land lowered the tone of the community. He invited me in." His home was neat, filled with books on history and architecture. It was the antithesis of a Gilded Meadows McMansion. I laid out the whole sordid story, the fraudulent annexation, the sale to Sterling Homes, the threatening phone call from Carol. He listened patiently, nodding, his expression growing darker with every detail. "I'm not surprised," he said when I'd finished. "I am horrified, but not surprised. Carol runs that place like her own personal fiefdom. The rest of the board are either her cronies or too intimidated to speak up. Richard, her husband, just rubber stamps everything she does. That's why I left." She proposed a rule to regulate the specific shade of white for window trims. "I spent 40 years designing bridges. For God's sake, I wasn't about to spend my retirement debating eggshell versus antique lace." I saw my opening. "Arthur, I need to see their financials. I'm a forensic accountant. I know there's something rotten in their books, especially concerning this deal with Sterling Homes. A kickback, a slush fund, something," he sighed, staring out the window. "They'll never let you near them. You'd have to sue, and they'd drag it out for years, draining your resources. It's their standard tactic." "That's why I need help," I pressed. "As a homeowner there, you still have rights. You have the right to inspect the records." He looked at me, a flicker of the old engineer's fight in his eyes. "Carol has made it procedurally impossible. You have to submit a written request with 30 days' notice. Specify exactly what you want to see down to the check number, and then they'll schedule a 3-hour window where you can sit in their lawyer's office and look at redacted printouts, with one of their goons watching you the whole time. No copies, no photos." It was a classic Stonewall, but it wasn't airtight. "What if," I said, leaning forward, "we didn't ask to see this year's records? What if we asked to see the records from when you were on the board? Could you argue you need to see them to confirm the accuracy of the minutes from your final meetings? Arthur considered this. A slow smile spread across his face. That's clever. That's very clever. She wouldn't be expecting that. It's a legitimate historical request. He paused. And I know just the document to ask for. The reserve study. It's a master plan for all future capital expenditures: road paving, pool repairs, roof replacements. They have to have one by law, and it has to be based on actual financial data. When I was there, we commissioned a very thorough one. I'll bet my pension they haven't updated it properly, and that Richard has been playing fast and loose with the reserve funds to finance Carol's vanity projects. And maybe more. This was it. This was the crack in the fortress wall. Arthur, my newfound ally, drafted the request that very afternoon. It was polite, formal, and legally precise. He requested a copy of the reserve study from his last year on the board, along with the corresponding financial statements that supported it. As predicted, the HOA's management company sent back a letter scheduling a viewing in 3 weeks' time at their lawyer's office under the strict no copies rule. They were following their obstructive procedure to the letter. They just didn't realize they were letting a Trojan horse through the gates. On the appointed day, Arthur and I went to the lawyer's office. As expected, a beefy paralegal who looked like a failed bouncer sat us at a large mahogany table and placed a single thick binder in front of Arthur. He gave us the no photos, no notes of specific numbers speech. I was simply there as Arthur's assistant, there to help the old man read the fine print. The paralegal retreated to a desk in the corner to watch us like a hawk. Arthur, playing his part beautifully, opened the binder and began slowly turning the pages, squinting and muttering about his eyesight. While the paralegal's attention was on him, my own work began. I wasn't looking for a single number. I was looking for patterns, anomalies, things that didn't belong. I had my phone in my lap, under the table, with a document scanning app open, but I didn't even need it at first. The fraud was so blatant it practically screamed from the pages. The reserve fund, which was legally restricted for long-term maintenance, was being used as a slush fund. There were huge, vaguely described payments to consultants, large landscaping fees paid to a company that, a quick search on my phone revealed, was registered to Carol Hess's maiden name. There were legal fees that far exceeded anything a normal HOA would incur, likely connected to their scheme to seize my land. Richard Hess wasn't just a rubber stamp. He was an active co-conspirator, cooking the books to hide his wife's profligacy and their criminal enterprise. While Arthur kept the guard occupied by asking him inane questions about a line item for pool chemicals, my eyes landed on the smoking gun. It was a wire transfer confirmation slip, carelessly tucked into the back of the binder. It was for $1 million. The transfer was from Sterling Homes to the Gilded Meadows HOA. It was dated 1 week before the HOA filed the fraudulent annexation petition with the county. And the memo line contained a single, damning phrase: Phase 2, Land Acquisition Deposit. It wasn't a settlement. It wasn't a fine. It was a deposit. They had been paid in advance by the developer to steal my farm. This wasn't just a civil matter anymore. This was wire fraud. This was conspiracy. This was a criminal case. I casually leaned back, feigning a yawn, and with my phone still under the table, I angled it just right and snapped a perfectly clear, high-resolution photo of that wire transfer slip. The paralegal didn't even blink. He just saw an old man and his board assistant. He had no idea I had just acquired the evidence that would not only get my land back, but would very likely send Carol and Richard Hess to prison. We left the office an hour later, Arthur looking dejected for the paralegal's benefit. Once we were in the car, a grin spread across my face. Arthur, I said, I think our work here is done. Phase 1 is complete. He looked at me, confused. Phase 1? I thought the goal was to get your land back. Oh, that's just the start, I replied, my mind already racing ahead, formulating the next devastating step. Phase 2 is where we take everything from them. The photograph of that wire transfer slip burned a hole in my digital pocket. It was the linchpin of their entire conspiracy, the hard proof that the annexation of my farm wasn't a misguided act of civic improvement, but a premeditated for-profit crime. This discovery fundamentally shifted my strategy. My initial goal was recovery, get my land back. My new goal was retribution. I wasn't just going to untangle their scheme. I was going to use the loose threads to weave a hangman's noose. And I had a truly audacious idea percolating, a plan so deeply rooted in financial law and poetic justice that it made me smile every time I thought of it. But first, I had to formalize my findings. I spent the next week sequestered in my office, transforming my raw intelligence into an impenetrable fortress of evidence. I wrote a detailed forensic report, over 100 pages long, that laid out the entire conspiracy in meticulous detail. It started with the history of my land, establishing my undisputed ownership. It documented every petty, harassing notice from the HOA. It detailed the fraudulent, abandoned property claim, proving my continuous use and payment of taxes. It included Arthur's testimony about the board's internal culture of intimidation under Carol Hess. The centerpiece of the report was the financial analysis. I detailed how Richard Hess had plundered the reserve fund for personal and political gain, with clear evidence of self-dealing and misappropriation. The landscaping company registered to Carol. The exorbitant consulting fees, it was all there. And then, the finale, a crystal-clear enlarged image of the $1 million wire transfer from Sterling Homes, dated before the annexation. I explained, in cold clinical terms, how this single document proved conspiracy, wire fraud, and honest services fraud. I wasn't just an angry farmer anymore. I was presenting a federal case on a silver platter. I made 3 copies of this report, one for the district attorney's office, one for the state attorney general, and one for the regional office of the FBI. I sent them all via courier, complete with a cover letter, offering my full cooperation and testimony as both a victim and an expert witness. That, however, was the conventional part of the plan. The criminal justice system would grind them down, but that could take years. Carol and Richard would get lawyers, post bail, and continue to live in their McMansion, presiding over their beige kingdom while the wheels of justice turned. I wanted something more immediate, more personal. I wanted to hit them where they lived, literally. This brings me to the core of my revenge, the part of the plan that still fills me with a grim sense of satisfaction. It was born from a deep dive I did into the Gilded Meadows founding documents, their CC, Rs, and the original master deed for the entire development. As I read through the legalese, I noticed something odd. The developer, Sterling Homes, had set up the HOA with an unusual amount of leverage for themselves. Tucked deep within the covenants was a clause related to capital improvement assessments. It stated that the developer, or its successor entity, the HOA, could levy special, large-scale assessments for major community improvements, but only if they followed an incredibly strict set of procedural and financial transparency rules. And to fund these initial improvements, the developer had taken out a massive loan, using the entire undeveloped land of the Gilded Meadows as collateral. When each house was sold, a portion of that master loan was supposed to be paid off, releasing that specific lot from the lien. It was a fairly standard, if slightly aggressive, development financing structure. But my forensic accountant's brain started to churn. The HOA had abused the reserve funds. Richard Hess's accounting was a work of criminal fiction. The legally required annual audits were either pencil-whipped or forged. They had most certainly not followed the strict procedural rules laid out in their own founding documents. Furthermore, I had a very strong suspicion, based on their sloppy bookkeeping, that they had failed to properly clear the portion of the master lien from each individual property as it was sold. I spent $1,000 to hire a top-tier title search company to do a deep dive on every single one of the 150 homes in Gilded Meadows. I asked them to look for one very specific thing: any lingering encumbrances related to the original master development loan. 3 weeks later, I got the results, and they were more beautiful than I could have possibly imagined. It was a systemic, catastrophic failure of paperwork. On almost 90% of the properties in Gilded Meadows, the sublien from that original master loan had never been properly extinguished. It was a tiny, dormant tick of a legal claim, buried so deep in the county records that no standard mortgage or title insurance check had ever caught it. But it was there, and legally, it was still valid. The original lender, a massive commercial bank, had packaged and sold that master loan years ago. It had been bundled, resold, and chopped into a dozen different debt instruments. It was a forgotten relic of the development's birth, and I realized, with a jolt of pure adrenaline, that I could buy it. I went to a specialist, a guy who deals in distressed debt, the kind of financial vulture who feasts on the carcasses of bankrupt companies. I showed him my research. He was skeptical at first, but after his own team vetted my findings, his eyes grew wide. "This is incredible," he said. "It's a ghost lien. It's almost never this clean. We found the current owner of that debt. It was a small hedge fund in Delaware that had bought it as part of a billion-dollar portfolio of miscellaneous debt, and they had no idea what they were holding. To them, it was just a non-performing 30-year-old loan attached to some land that had long since been developed. It had a face value of several $1,000,000 from decades ago, but its actual market value was near zero. They thought it was worthless. After some negotiation, my distressed debt guy, acting on my behalf, bought the entire debt instrument, the ghost lien, on almost the entire Gilded Meadows community for the grand sum of $300,000. I now owned the original, senior-most debt on their homes. Now came the masterstroke. Armed with this lien and my forensic report proving the HOA board's gross financial mismanagement, I had my lawyer draft another letter. This one was not addressed to Carol. It was addressed to every single homeowner in the Gilded Meadows. The letter calmly explained the situation. It detailed the board's fraudulent activities, the theft of my land, and the plundering of the reserve funds. I included the cover page of my report to the FBI. Then, I explained the consequences of that mismanagement. I told them that because the board, under the leadership of Carol and Richard Hess, had violated the financial transparency covenants of the CCRs, they had triggered a default clause in the original master loan agreement, a loan which I, through a holding company I'd created, now owned. As the new lender, I was exercising my legal right to call the entire loan due immediately. Each homeowner was now personally on the hook for their portion of that decades-old loan, a sum that, with interest and penalties, amounted to roughly $50,000 per household. They had 30 days to pay my holding company directly. If they failed to pay, I would have no choice but to begin foreclosure proceedings on their homes to satisfy the debt. I had, in essence, legally hijacked their mortgages. I had become their bank, and I was about to call in the debt that their own corrupt leaders had defaulted on. The panic that must have erupted in that beige utopia is something I still savor. I had turned their greatest weapon, their own labyrinthine rules and regulations, against them. They had tried to steal my dirt. I was about to legally own their houses. The day my letter arrived in the 150 mailboxes of the Gilded Meadows was, I imagine, a day that will live in infamy in that particular corner of suburbia. The carefully curated tranquility of their beige and taupe world shattered. The legal language was dense, but the conclusion was terrifyingly simple. Pay a stranger $50,000 you don't have, or risk losing your $500,000 home, all because of the woman you elected to police your mailbox color. The wave of panic and fury crashed directly where I intended it to, on the manicured lawn of Carol and Richard Hess. According to my ally Arthur, who was watching the neighborhood's private social media page with glee, the immediate aftermath was chaos. People were flooding the page with frantic questions. Conspiracy theories bloomed. At first, many thought it was a scam, a sophisticated hoax. Then, one homeowner, a real estate lawyer, apparently confirmed the validity of the lien. The ghost was real. Carol, in her infinite arrogance, tried to get ahead of it. She posted a long, rambling message calling me a disgruntled, litigious lunatic. She accused me of fabricating the claims, of terrorizing the community. She assured everyone that the HOA's lawyers would handle this frivolous attack, and that everything was under control. It was precisely the wrong move. Her denial, in the face of the cold, hard legal documents I had provided, looked like a desperate lie. Worse, for her, was the detail I had included about the FBI investigation. People weren't just scared of losing their homes anymore. They were scared of being associated with a federal crime. Suddenly, the meticulously documented forensic report I'd sent them looked less like the ravings of a madman and more like Exhibit A in a case against their leadership. The tipping point came 3 days later. A convoy of black sedans, the kind with government plates that look so out of place in a suburban cul-de-sac, rolled slowly down the main street of Gilded Meadows. FBI agents, polite but firm, raided the Hess residence and the HOA's small administrative office. They were seen carrying out boxes of documents in computer towers. Carol and Richard were led out in handcuffs. The image, which was thankfully captured by a neighbor on their phone and immediately went viral within the community, was devastating. The Queen and her consort, the arbiters of suburban taste, were being treated like common criminals. Their power, built on a foundation of intimidation and petty rules, evaporated in the reflection of flashing blue and red lights. My conventional attack had just perfectly complemented my unconventional one. The criminal investigation gave my financial claims undeniable weight. No one could claim I was a crank anymore. This is where my plan entered its final, most brutal phase. The Hesses were out on bail within a day, but their authority was shattered. An emergency homeowner meeting was called, not by the board, but by the homeowners themselves. It was held on the community's great lawn, the very place Carol had envisioned for quaint summer festivals. Instead, it was the site of a revolution. Arthur attended and gave me a play-by-play. It was a bloodbath. Homeowners who had been terrified of receiving a fine for their grass being a quarter-inch too long were now openly screaming for the entire board's resignation. The real estate lawyer who had confirmed the lien explained the mechanics of my maneuver to the stunned crowd. He explained that my claim was legally sound, and that their only recourse was to either pay me or sue the HOA and, by extension, themselves for the gross negligence that led to the default. The board members, stripped of Carol's protection, crumbled one by one, resigning on the spot. Finally, Carol herself took the microphone, looking pale and haggard. She tried to rally them, to appeal to their sense of community, to paint me as the villain, but no one was buying it. When she finished her speech, there was only silence. Then from the back of the crowd someone started to slowly, deliberately, applaud. It was Arthur. It was a perfect, solitary, damning act of sarcastic defiance. The meeting dissolved. The old regime was finished. An interim board was formed with one purpose: to negotiate with me. Their lawyer contacted mine the next day. The tone was no longer dismissive. It was one of desperate supplication. They asked what I wanted. My demands were simple, and I had them delivered with cold finality. First, the Gilded Meadows HOA, using its own funds, would buy my 2,500 acres back from Sterling Homes at the current market value, which had appreciated significantly. They would then sign the deed back over to me, free and clear of all encumbrances. Second, the HOA would pay for the complete restoration of any part of my land that had been damaged by Sterling Homes' preliminary survey work. And they would pay for the planting of a 100-foot wide buffer of mature native trees along our entire shared border. Third, the HOA would formally, publicly apologize for the fraudulent annexation and the actions of the Hess-led board. Fourth, they would pay all of my legal fees, the cost of the title searches, and the cost of acquiring the debt instrument. And fifth, and this was the beautiful part, the $50,000 liens on their individual homes would be forgiven on a case-by-case basis. Forgiveness for each household was contingent on that household providing a signed affidavit, admissible in court, detailing any and all unethical or suspicious interactions they had ever had with Carol or Richard Hess. It was a masterstroke of intelligence gathering, turning the entire community into a pool of witnesses against their former leaders. The alternative? I would proceed with the foreclosures. Checkmate. They had no choice. They agreed to everything. The look on the face of the Sterling Homes CEO, when he was legally forced to sell my own land back to me at a premium, must have been a picture. The HOA had to levy a massive special assessment on all its members to cover the costs, an irony so thick you could taste it. Their attempt to save money and increase their property values by stealing my land ended up costing them millions and cratering those very same values. Over the next month, I received over 100 signed affidavits. They were a treasure trove of petty tyranny and corruption. Stories of Carol extorting free landscaping services in exchange for overlooking violations. Tales of Richard using HOA funds to pave his brother-in-law's driveway. Each one was a nail in their legal coffin. As each affidavit came in, I had my lawyer formally file a release of the lien on that person's home. The people who cooperated were made whole. Those who refused to cooperate, a small handful of Carol's staunchest allies, were not so lucky. I let the foreclosure process initiate on their homes, only to be bought out at the last minute by the desperate HOA itself, further increasing the financial pain for everyone else. Finally, it was done. The deed to my farm, my full 2,500 acres, was back in my hands. The new trees were being planted. The money was back in my account. The FBI and the DA's office now had a mountain of sworn testimony to add to their cases against the Hesses. Carol and Richard, facing financial ruin and a mountain of evidence, eventually took a plea deal. Carol got 3 years in a federal, white-collar prison. Richard got 5 years of probation and a lifetime ban from ever holding a fiduciary position again. They were forced to sell their precious McMansion to pay for their legal fees and restitution to the HOA. The last I heard, they were living in a small, rented apartment on the bad side of town. The Gilded Meadows was a changed place. The new board, chastened and humbled, gutted the old oppressive CCRs. The neighborhood became a little less perfect, a little more human. My revenge was complete. It was surgical, it was devastating, and best of all, it was entirely, unimpeachably legal. I took a system designed to bully people and turned it into a perfectly calibrated instrument of justice. Drop a comment if you've ever had to deal with an out-of-control HOA. And don't forget to subscribe, because standing up to bullies is what we're all about. They took my land, so I took their homes, their power, and their pride. And I'd do it again in a heartbeat.